In the autumn of 1951, the nation was busy stitching itself together. Roads were planned across ridges and hollers. Survey lines were drawn through places long left alone. But some places are not waiting to be found. Some have spent generations forgetting the world exists. When a junior state official failed to check in during a routine mapping assignment, a search party was sent into the hills of central Appalachia. They expected to find a man lost in the woods. Instead, they found a cabin, and inside, 13 near-identical siblings, the product of silence, inbreeding, and time. None of them had ever seen a stranger. If you're drawn to stories buried in old paper and darker places, consider subscribing. We tell what was never meant to be heard. His name was Arthur Penn. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles. His world was the grid on a map, the clean ink of a newly drawn border. He believed in the logical progression of things, point A to point B. His reports, filed weekly with the county office in Sedalia, were models of precision. They noted soil composition. They described timber quality. They measured elevation with an almost religious devotion. Arthur Penn was not a man of the woods. He was a man sent to tame them, to translate their chaotic growth into columns and figures. He saw the mountains not as a living thing, but as a problem to be solved, a territory to be cataloged and, eventually, subdued. His superiors liked him for this. He was 27 years old. He was diligent. He did not ask questions that were not on the form. On the 3rd of October, 1951, he set out from a small logging camp at the edge of the known survey area. His task was simple. He was to push a new line 3 miles east, into a section of forest marked on all maps as empty, uninhabited. He carried a compass, a bedroll, and enough food for 4 days. He was expected back on the 7th. His final radio check-in was clear and brief. He said the tree line was dense. He said the air was still. He sounded, for the first time, uncertain. When the 10th of October came and went, there was still no word. At first, the office in Sedalia was not overly concerned. The mountains swallowed time. A man could get turned around. A sprained ankle could cost a man 3 days. But Arthur Penn was meticulous. He was never late. By the 11th, a quiet worry had begun to curdle in the county administrator's stomach. A call was made. The man who answered the call was Sheriff Brody. He was the opposite of Arthur Penn. He was a man of curves and suggestions. A man who understood that the shortest path between 2 points in these hills was never a straight line. He had been sheriff of the county for nearly 20 years. He knew the hollers like the lines on his own hand. He knew the families who lived in them. He knew the stories they told when the sun went down. He had heard whispers of places where the maps were wrong, where the lines drawn in some far-off office meant nothing at all. Sheriff Brody assembled a small party, 2 deputies, young men who still trusted their compasses more than their guts, and a local tracker named Silas, who was old enough to remember when the wolves still sang in these mountains. Silas did not speak much. He looked at Arthur Penn's planned route on the map. He just shook his head slowly. They set out at dawn on the 12th of October. The air was cold and sharp. The leaves were a riot of red and gold. It was beautiful, but it was a hungry kind of beauty. The forest floor was a soft carpet of decay. It muffled their footsteps. It made the world unnervingly quiet. They found Arthur Penn's camp after a few hours. It was exactly where it should have been. The fire was cold. A half-eaten can of beans sat on a log. It was a place a man had intended to return to. From the camp, they followed the survey markers, small flags of bright orange plastic tied to branches. They were an alien intrusion in the deep green and brown of the woods. They were a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man who believed in order. The markers led them eastward, deeper into the woods than any logging trail went. After 2 miles, the forest began to change. The trees grew older, their trunks were thicker, their branches knitted together overhead, stealing the sunlight. The air grew heavy and damp. The orange markers, once so bright, now seemed weak and foolish, a child's toy in a giant's house. The birds had all gone silent. The only sound was the rustle of their own movement, a silence that felt measured, a silence that was listening. Silas, the tracker, stopped. He held up a hand. Sheriff Brody and the deputies froze. Silas knelt. He pointed to the ground. There, beside Arthur Penn's boot print, was another mark. It was not an animal's track. It was the print of a bare foot, small, almost delicate. Sheriff Brody felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. People did not go barefoot in these woods, not unless they were lost and panicked, or not unless they belonged here. The survey flag stopped abruptly. The last orange ribbon fluttered from a low-hanging pine branch. Beyond it, there was nothing, just an unbroken wall of ancient trees and deep shadow. Arthur Penn's straight line had run into something it could not cross. The deputies looked at the sheriff. They expected him to call off the search, to turn back and report the surveyor as lost, presumed dead. But Silas was already moving. He had found something else. Not a path, not a trail, more like a suggestion of passage, a place where the moss was slightly thinner on the trees, a way the ground dipped almost imperceptibly. It was a route that only a creature of the woods would know, or make. Silas looked back at the sheriff. He said the surveyor went this way. He said he was not running. He was following. They followed the ghost trail for what felt like miles. Time seemed to warp in the deep woods. The sun was gone. The world was a gloom of green and gray. They moved in single file. The silence was absolute. It pressed in on them. It felt older than the trees. And then they smelled it. Wood smoke. Faint, but unmistakable. They crested a small rise, and they saw it. Below them, in a shallow bowl of land, was a cabin. It was a thing of impossible age. The wood was the color of old bone, silvered and worn by 100 years of rain. The roof was a thick pelt of green moss. A single stone chimney leaked a pale ribbon of smoke into the still air. There was one window, a dark, square hole that seemed to watch them. There were no paths leading to it or from it, no garden, no fence, no sign of livestock. It was as if the cabin had grown from the earth itself. It was not on any map. It should not have existed. Sheriff Brody held his hand on his revolver. He told his deputies to stay back. He and Silas would approach. Every instinct told him to turn around, to leave this place to its secrets. But Arthur Penn was a state official. A man was missing, and this cabin, this impossible structure, was the only answer in a forest of questions. They walked down the slope. The ground was soft under their boots. The air grew colder as they neared the cabin. The smell of wood smoke was stronger now. It was mixed with something else, the scent of unwashed bodies, of damp earth, of something vaguely sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in the smokehouse. The front of the cabin was bare. The door was made of thick, rough-hewn planks. There was no handle, no knocker, just wood. Sheriff Brody raised his fist. He hesitated for a moment. He was a man of the law. He was about to knock on a door that had not been knocked on in a lifetime, maybe longer. He knocked. 3 hard raps. The sound was swallowed by the wood, by the silence. Nothing happened. He waited. A full minute. He looked back at Silas. The old tracker's face was a mask. He was watching the window. Brody knocked again. Harder this time. The sound echoed, thin and lonely. Still, there was no answer. He told Silas he was going in. He said he had to know. He put his shoulder to the door. It resisted. He pushed harder. With a deep groaning scrape of wood on wood, the door swung inward. It opened into darkness, a thick, suffocating gloom. The stench washed over them. It was overpowering. Sheriff Brody took a step inside. His eyes struggled to adjust. The light from the open door cut a dusty rectangle onto the floor, and in that light, he saw movement, a shape detaching itself from the deeper shadows, then another, and another. They did not make a sound. They just emerged, eyes reflecting the dim light like animals. When his vision cleared, he counted them. There were 13. Faces, pale and nearly identical, floated in the gloom. They were children, or they looked like children. Some were small, no older than 5 or 6. Others seemed to be in their late teens, but they all shared the same face, the same wide, colorless eyes, the same lank, straw-colored hair. Their features were slightly blurred, not quite finished, like a photograph left too long in the developing tray. They stood in a loose semicircle. Their clothes were simple shifts made of some coarse, undyed cloth. Their feet were bare. They were unnervingly still. They showed no fear, no surprise. They just watched him. Their gaze was not curious. It was a look of blank, unified appraisal, like a single organism looking out through 13 pairs of eyes. Sheriff Brody's breath caught in his throat. He could hear one of his deputies behind him make a small, choked sound, In the far corner of the cabin, beyond the silent children, he saw something else. Arthur Penn's surveying tripod. It was neatly folded, leaning against the wall. Beside it, on a crude wooden table, was his leather-bound notebook. It was open. The sheriff took a slow step forward. The children did not move. They did not part. He had to walk around them, their heads turned in perfect unison to follow him. He reached the table. He looked down at the open page. It was Arthur Penn's familiar, precise handwriting. The last entry was dated the 4th of October. It read, "The line ended. I found them, or they found me. They make no sound. But there is a song. It is behind their eyes. They are all the same one. I am not lost. I am..." The last word trailed off into a jagged, meaningless line, as if the pen had been dragged from his hand. Sheriff Brody looked up from the notebook. He scanned the dark corners of the cabin. There was no sign of Arthur Penn, just the children, watching him. The silence in the cabin was a physical weight. Then, one of them moved, the tallest one, a girl who might have been 17 or 30. She stepped forward. Her bare feet made no sound on the dirt floor. She reached out a long, pale hand. Her fingers were slender, her nails were like yellowed ivory. She did not look at the sheriff. She looked at the notebook. She placed her hand flat upon the open page, a gesture of ownership, of finality. Her eyes, and all the other eyes, never left Sheriff Brody's face. He felt a profound and irrational cold. It had nothing to do with the damp air of the cabin. It was the cold of a place where human rules had long since evaporated. The law he represented was a foreign language here, a joke told in a graveyard. He looked past the girl. The cabin was a single, large room. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. In the massive stone hearth at the far end, a few embers pulsed with a weak, orange light. There were no beds, just tidy piles of straw and rough, dark blankets in the corners. There were no shelves of preserves, no tools of the modern world, no clock to measure the hours. It was a space outside of time, a sealed vessel. One of his deputies, a young man named Eli Vance, made a soft noise at the door, a sound of disbelief. Sheriff Brody held up a hand, telling him to stay put. He needed to be sure. He needed to find a body, or a sign of struggle, something to write in his report that made sense. He took another step into the room, his boots heavy on the dirt floor. The children shifted. They did not move out of his way. They flowed around him, a single, silent current of flesh. They maintained a precise distance, always just beyond his reach. He could feel the warmth coming off their bodies. He could smell the scent of wood smoke and unwashed hair. He was an island, and they were the tide. He forced himself to look at them, truly look. The family resemblance was absolute, frightening. The same pale, almost translucent skin. The same straw-colored hair, cut in a ragged line across the brow. The same slight asymmetry in the eyes, one lid drooping a fraction lower than the other. It was a single face, copied and pasted onto bodies of different sizes. A dozen variations on a single, flawed theme. Some of the smaller ones clutched the shifts of the larger ones, but they made no childish sounds. They just watched. Their stillness was the most terrifying thing of all. There was nothing on the walls, no faded photographs of ancestors, no cross to a forgotten god. The only decoration was on the stone mantel above the hearth, a small, carved object, a wooden bird. Brody moved toward it. The children eddied around him, silent as ever. The carving was crude but powerful. A bird, yes, but it had too many wings, 4 of them, layered one on top of the other. Its head was tilted back, its beak open in a silent scream. It was a deeply unsettling object, a thing born of a lonely and twisted imagination. He reached out a hand to touch it. A sound broke the silence. It came from the tall girl by the table, a low click, deep in her throat. It was not a human sound. It was the noise an insect might make, a dry, chitinous rattle. The moment she made it, the other 12 made it too. The same click, in perfect, unnerving unison. The air in the cabin thickened with the sound. It was not loud, but it vibrated through the floor, through the soles of the sheriff's boots. It filled the space behind his eyes. He remembered the words in Arthur Penn's notebook. There is a song. It is behind their eyes. This was the song, a rhythm of wrongness, a pulse of isolation. Sheriff Brody pulled his hand back from the carving, as if burned. The clicking stopped instantly. The silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. It was now an absence, a held breath. He knew then that he would not find Arthur Penn's body. The surveyor was not here. He was not anywhere. He had been absorbed, digested by this place. His notebook on the table was a bone coughed up after the meal. He looked at Silas. The old tracker's eyes were dark. He gave a slight, sharp shake of his head. It was a clear command. We leave. We leave now. There was nothing more to do here. Not today. This was not a situation for 3 men and a revolver. This was a matter for the state. For doctors and men who wrote papers on things society preferred to forget. He had to go back. He had to make a report. A report he knew no one would believe. He began to back away, toward the rectangle of gray light that was the open door. The children did not follow. They remained in their loose formation in the center of the room, their heads turned as one, tracking his retreat. The tall girl's hand remained flat on the notebook, a silent sentinel. He and Silas stepped backward over the threshold, into the world they knew. Deputy Vance and the other man were waiting, their faces pale and taut. Eli Vance looked at his sheriff. He started to ask a question. He wanted to know what they had just seen, but the words died on his lips. There was no question that could hold the answer. Sheriff Brody reached out and took hold of the heavy plank door. He pulled it shut. The scrape of old wood was loud in the quiet woods. It sounded like a cell door closing, locking away a secret that should have remained buried. Outside, the forest seemed darker. The trees seemed to be leaning in, listening. He did not need to look back at the cabin. He could feel it behind him, and he could feel the 13 pairs of identical eyes staring at the door, waiting. They had time. They had all the time in the world. The walk back was a silent affair. The forest had taken their words. Each man was alone with the image of the cabin, alone with the 13 pale faces. The silence in the woods was different on the return. It was no longer empty. It was full of eyes. Sheriff Brody felt them on his back with every step. He did not need to look. He knew they were watching. Deputy Vance stumbled twice. His youthful confidence had been scraped away, leaving something raw and nervous underneath. He kept glancing over his shoulder. He was looking for movement in the deep shadows between the trees. He saw it everywhere. The other deputy, a man named Marcus Cole, just stared at his own boots. He walked with a mechanical rhythm, as if he were trying to march his way back to a world that made sense. Silas, the tracker, led them. He moved with the same quiet grace, but his shoulders were tense. He held his head at a new angle. He was listening, not for the sounds of the forest he knew. He was listening for the sound he did not know, the dry, insect click from the cabin, the sound of the song behind their eyes. It was nearly dusk when they found the survey line again. The small orange flag seemed pathetic, a failed attempt to impose order on a place that did not want it. They followed the markers back to Arthur Penn's abandoned camp. This time, no one stopped. They walked past the cold fire and the half-eaten can of beans. They walked until the ancient woods gave way to younger, thinner trees, until they could hear the distant growl of a logging truck on a far-off road. The sound was a promise of rules and reasons. They reached their vehicle as the last light failed. The drive back to Sedalia was dark and quiet. The headlights cut a tunnel through the night. Inside the truck, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Sheriff Brody drove. He watched the white lines of the road appear and disappear. He tried to assemble the facts. 13 children, 1 cabin, no sign of a struggle, 1 missing surveyor, 1 notebook with a final, broken sentence. These were the pieces, but they did not fit together. They formed a picture of madness. The lights of Sedalia were a welcome sight. The small town was settled in for the night. Porch lights glowed, a dog barked. It was the ordinary world. A world where things like the cabin were not supposed to exist. Sheriff Brody drove straight to the county administrator's office. He knew the man would be there, waiting. County Administrator Reginald Thompson was a man who lived by the clock. He was thin and precise. His desk was always clear. His papers were always filed. He looked up when Sheriff Brody entered. The sheriff's clothes were dirty. His face was grim. The administrator's neat office seemed to shrink from the wildness he carried in with him. Administrator Thompson asked if they had found him. He meant Arthur Penn. His voice was crisp, expectant. Sheriff Brody took off his hat. He held it in his hands. He said yes and no. He told the administrator that they had found where Penn had gone. He described the woods, the way the trail had ended. He described finding the cabin. He spoke in a low, even voice. He was careful with his words. He was trying to build a bridge between the world he had just left and the world of this clean, well-lit office. He did not mention the identical faces. Not at first. He did not mention the clicking sound. He said they found a family living in isolation, a family of 13 children. He said they seemed unwell. He said Arthur Penn's equipment was there. His notebook was on a table. But the man himself was gone. Administrator Thompson listened. His face was a mask of professional patience. When the sheriff finished, the administrator picked up a pen. He tapped it once on his clean blotter. He asked if Brody was suggesting the family had harmed the surveyor. He asked if there was evidence of violence. Sheriff Brody said no. He said there was no evidence of anything. That was the problem. He tried to explain the stillness of the place, the unnatural quiet of the children. He said it was like walking into a room that had been holding its breath for 100 years. The administrator did not understand. He spoke of vagrants, of mountain folk who distrusted the government. He suggested they had likely scared Arthur Penn off, that he was probably wandering the woods, lost. He said the search party should go back in the morning, a larger party this time. They would search a 5-mile radius from the cabin. Sheriff Brody shook his head. He said Penn was not lost in the woods. He was lost in that cabin. He finally told the administrator about the faces. He described how they were all the same. He told him they did not speak. They did not react. They just watched. He said it was not natural. Administrator Thompson put down his pen. He looked at the sheriff as if he were a difficult equation. He asked if the sheriff was tired. He suggested the long day in the woods had affected his judgment. He said people could look similar, especially families who lived in isolation. He was searching for a rational explanation, a box to put the horror in. It was then that Sheriff Brody knew. He could not make this man understand. Words were not enough. He told the administrator he would write his report, but he said a larger search party was not the answer. Sending more men with maps and compasses into that place was a mistake. It was like sending mice to investigate a snake. He said they needed someone else, someone who understood the mind. For the first time, Administrator Thompson looked uncertain. The sheriff's sincerity was a crack in his tidy world. He asked what Brody was proposing. The sheriff said they needed a doctor, maybe someone from the state university, a man named Dr. Harold Whitmore. He was a psychologist. He had consulted on difficult cases before, cases that did not fit neatly into a file. Brody said this was one of those cases. The administrator was silent for a long time. The only sound in the office was the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He looked at the mud on the sheriff's boots. He looked at the exhaustion etched on his face. He finally gave a slow, reluctant nod. He said he would make a call in the morning, but he wanted a full written report on his desk by then. A report that stuck to the facts. Sheriff Brody agreed. He walked out of the bright office and back into the night. He went to his own office. The place smelled of old paper and stale coffee. He sat at his desk. He took out a fresh sheet of paper. He began to write. He wrote about the journey, the changing woods, the silent tracker. He described the cabin's location, the discovery of Arthur Penn's equipment. He wrote down the names of the deputies who had been with him. These were the facts. But the facts were a skeleton. They had no skin, no life. How could he write the feeling of being watched by 13 identical pairs of eyes? How could he describe the sound of a song that was not a song? He wrote that the family consisted of 1 adult female and 12 other children of various ages. He wrote that they appeared to be the product of long-term genetic isolation. He used clinical, detached language. He knew it was a lie, a comfortable lie for men like Administrator Thompson. He wrote for hours. The words came slowly. Each one felt like a betrayal of what he had seen. He remembered the tall girl's hand on the notebook, her silent claim. He remembered the carved bird with its 4 wings and silent scream. It was a symbol of this place, a thing made wrong. He finished the report just before dawn. He read it over once. It was a document of failure. It captured none of the truth. It was just a collection of words that would allow the system to proceed. It would allow them to send a doctor into the woods, to try and put a name to the wrongness. He folded the paper. He put it in an envelope. He knew that Dr. Harold Whitmore would read this report. And he would come. He would come with his books and his theories. He would try to measure and catalog the family in the cabin. The sheriff felt a deep sense of dread. They had found the cabin, but now the cabin had found them. They had opened a door, and they had no idea what they were inviting to cross the threshold. The report was not an ending. It was a key a key he was about to hand over. He wondered if Arthur Penn had also tried to understand, if he had tried to put them into words, and he wondered if that was the moment they had finally taken him. 2 days later, Dr. Harold Whitmore arrived. He did not look like a man who spent his time in the dark corners of the human mind. He was small and tidy. He wore a tweed jacket with leather patches on the elbows. His hair was neatly parted. He carried a worn leather briefcase. He looked like a professor who had taken a wrong turn on his way to a lecture. He met Sheriff Brody in his office. Administrator Thompson was also there. The administrator had an air of forced control. He wanted this situation handled, cleanly, quietly. He introduced the doctor to the sheriff. Dr. Whitmore had a soft handshake. His eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. They took in the sheriff's tired expression. The map spread on the wall, the faint smell of the woods that still clung to the room. He did not sit immediately. He walked to the map. He asked the sheriff to show him the location. Sheriff Brody traced the route with his finger. He pointed to the blank space where the cabin sat. Dr. Whitmore nodded slowly. He asked questions. His voice was calm, measured. He asked about the cabin's construction, the state of the interior, the clothing of the children. He asked about their physical condition. Did they appear malnourished? Did they have any obvious injuries or deformities beyond the facial similarities? The sheriff answered as best he could. He said they were thin, but not starving. He said their deformities were subtle, the slightly drooping eyelid, the way their fingers were a little too long, the unnerving symmetry of their flaws. He described the lack of any personal items, the absence of color, of life. Administrator Thompson shifted in his chair. He cleared his throat. He said the family was likely just scared. He called them unfortunates, a problem to be managed. He spoke of social services, of relocation. His words were the tools of a bureaucracy trying to flatten an anomaly. Dr. Whitmore did not look at the administrator. He kept his eyes on the sheriff. He asked about the sound, the clicking. Brody described it. He tried to convey the perfect unison, the non-human quality of it. The doctor listened intently. He made a small note on a pad he took from his briefcase. Then, he asked the most important question. He asked about the mother. Sheriff Brody had described the oldest girl, the one who had claimed the notebook. The doctor asked him to be more specific. Was she their mother, or just the eldest sibling? The sheriff paused. He had assumed she was the eldest sister, but now, thinking back, he was not sure. There was an authority to her, a stillness that was different from the others. He recalled the way the smaller children had stood near her, but there was no sign of a matriarch, no older woman who would fit the role of a mother or grandmother. They were a flock without a shepherd, or perhaps the shepherd was one of them. Dr. Whitmore seemed to understand his hesitation. He said that in cases of extreme isolation, familial roles can become blurred, distorted. He said he would need to see them for himself. He wanted to go to the cabin. Administrator Thompson objected. He said it was not safe. He wanted to send a larger, armed party to secure the area first. He spoke of protocol. Dr. Whitmore shook his head gently. He said that would be a catastrophic mistake. He explained that a show of force would be perceived as a threat. It would shatter whatever fragile reality existed in that cabin. He said if they wanted to understand, they had to approach on tiptoe. He said he wanted to go with only 2 other people, Sheriff Brody and the tracker, Silas. He said they had already been accepted, in a way. They had entered and left without incident. They were a known variable. The administrator argued, but the doctor was firm. His mild demeanor concealed a core of steel. He was not asking for permission. He was stating his method. Reluctantly, Thompson agreed. He made it clear that any negative outcome would be on the doctor's head. The next morning, they set out. The doctor carried his leather briefcase. Silas carried a small pack with water and some food. The sheriff carried the weight of his own dread. The walk felt different this time. The woods were just woods. The silence was just silence. The doctor's calm academic presence had changed the nature of the journey. He paused occasionally to observe a type of fungus on a tree. He identified a bird by its call. He was cataloging the environment, treating it like a laboratory. When they smelled the wood smoke, the doctor stopped. He took a deep breath. He looked at the sheriff. He said that from this point forward, they would not speak, not unless absolutely necessary. He said their actions must be slow, deliberate, non-threatening. He said they were not on a rescue mission. They were on a mission of observation. He told them to mirror the family's stillness, to become part of the quiet. They approached the cabin. It looked the same, a thing of bone and moss, a silent monument to a forgotten history. The smoke rising from the chimney was the only sign of life. This time, they did not knock. Following the doctor's lead, they simply stood before the door. They waited. For 5 minutes, they stood in complete silence. The sheriff felt a growing tension. This felt wrong, passive, but he trusted the doctor's instinct. Finally, Dr. Whitmore reached out. He did not knock. He laid his palm flat against the wood of the door. A gesture of peaceful intent, a request, not a demand. They waited another 5 minutes. Nothing. The sheriff was about to suggest they had gone, that the cabin was empty. But then, he heard it. A faint scraping sound from within. The sound of the bar being lifted. The door swung open. Not all the way, just a few inches. A sliver of darkness. In the crack, an eye appeared. One pale, colorless eye. It regarded them for a long moment. Then, the door opened fully. The tall girl stood there. The one Brody now thought of as the mother-sister. She was holding the door. She looked at each of them in turn. Her gaze lingered on Dr. Whitmore, on his tidy jacket and his leather briefcase. She stepped back, a silent invitation. They entered. The cabin was exactly as they had left it. The same gloom, the same smell, the same 13 figures, arranged like pieces on a game board. They were in the same positions, so much so that the sheriff wondered if they had moved at all in the past 3 days. Dr. Whitmore walked to the center of the room. He placed his briefcase on the dirt floor. He opened it. He did not take out any instruments, no charts, no needles. He took out a small, polished wooden apple. He took out a handful of smooth, gray river stones. He took out a simple child's kaleidoscope. He arranged them neatly on the floor, an offering. He then sat down. He crossed his legs. He did not look at the children directly. He looked at the objects he had placed on the ground. He waited. Sheriff Brody and Silas stood near the door. They followed the doctor's example. They remained still. They breathed slowly. They tried to fade into the background. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sound was the faint hiss and pop of the embers in the hearth. The sheriff watched the children. They had not moved. Their eyes were fixed on the doctor, on the strange objects shimmering on the floor. Then, one of the smallest children, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7, took a hesitant step forward. He moved slowly, as if unsure of his own legs. He stopped a few feet from the objects. His head was cocked. He was looking at the kaleidoscope. Its brass fittings caught a stray beam of light from the door. The tall mother-sister made no move to stop him. She watched, her face a blank canvas. The little boy took another step. He reached out a small, grimy hand. His fingers hovered over the kaleidoscope. He looked back at the tall girl. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The boy picked it up. He held it in both hands. He did not seem to know what it was. He shook it. He put it to his ear. Then, guided by some deep, buried instinct, he raised it to his eye. He pointed it toward the light of the open door. His body went rigid. A small gasp escaped his lips. It was the first truly human sound the sheriff had heard in this cabin. It was a sound of wonder. The boy lowered the kaleidoscope. He looked at the doctor. For the first time, an expression crossed his face. It was not fear. It was not anger. It was confusion. Pure, unfiltered confusion. He was seeing something new, a pattern where there was once only gray. He held the kaleidoscope out to the child standing next to him, a girl of the same size. She took it. She looked through it. The same reaction, a sharp intake of breath, a moment of stunned silence. The kaleidoscope was passed from child to child, a piece of the outside world being shared, a virus of color and light. Dr. Whitmore did not smile. He did not move. He simply watched his experiment unfold. He had not used words. He had not used force. He had used curiosity. He had found a crack in their wall of silence, and he had inserted a wedge. Sheriff Brody watched the kaleidoscope move through the group. He felt a sliver of hope, but it was mixed with a deeper fear. They were teaching the children about the world, but what was the world about to learn from them? Dr. Whitmore visited the cabin 3 more times that week. Each time, he followed the same ritual. He approached with Sheriff Brody and Silas. He waited patiently at the door. He brought new offerings from his briefcase, a prism that cast rainbows on the dark wooden walls, a small music box that played a simple, tinkling melody, a set of smooth, painted blocks. The children, in turn, slowly began to change. Their rigid stillness softened. When the doctor arrived, They would gather around his offerings with a quiet, intense curiosity. They never spoke, not with words, but a silent language began to emerge, a language of gesture, of shared glances. The small boy who had first touched the kaleidoscope, whom the doctor privately named the Catalyst, would often act as a go-between. He would be the first to investigate a new object, his reactions signaling to the others whether it was safe. The tall mother-sister remained aloof. She watched the proceedings from a distance. Her face was unreadable. She permitted the interactions, but she did not participate. Her stillness was a constant, unsettling presence, a reminder that this fragile peace was conditional. She was the gatekeeper, and the gate could close at any time. Dr. Whitmore never pushed. He never asked a direct question. He simply observed. He took copious notes in a small leather-bound journal when he returned to Sedalia each evening. He was mapping their world. He noted their social structure. It was not a hierarchy. It was a network, a hive. They moved and thought with a collective consciousness that baffled him. An action by one child would be instantly understood and reacted to by the others, without any visible or audible cue. He documented their diet. It consisted of foraged roots, mushrooms, and a steady supply of smoked meat, which Silas identified as squirrel and rabbit. They were expert survivors. Their knowledge of the forest was absolute. They were not prisoners of the wilderness. They were a part of its fabric. On his fourth visit, the doctor decided it was time. He had established a baseline of trust. He needed to understand their history, their origin. He knew he could not ask. He had to make them show him. That morning, he brought something different. He did not bring a toy or a curiosity. He brought a large, blank sheet of artist's paper and a box of charcoal sticks. He laid the paper on the dirt floor, in the center of the room. He took a piece of charcoal. He drew a simple stick figure, a man. He looked at the children, then pointed to himself. Then he drew another stick figure and pointed to Sheriff Brody, a third for Silas. Then he drew a small, crude picture of the cabin. He looked at the children. He handed a piece of charcoal to the Catalyst. The boy took it. He understood the invitation. He knelt by the paper. The other children gathered around, their pale heads bent together, their eyes fixed on the blank space. The Catalyst did not draw a person. He drew a shape, a spiral. He drew it in the center of the paper. He drew it over and over, the charcoal pressing deep into the paper. It was a powerful, hypnotic motion. When he was done, he looked at one of the older girls. She took the charcoal from him. She added to the spiral. She drew lines radiating out from it, and on the end of each line, she drew a small circle. She drew 13 lines, 13 circles, a map of themselves, a sun with 13 planets. Then the tall mother-sister moved. It was the first time she had approached the doctor's offerings. She knelt. Her movements were fluid, graceful. She took the charcoal from the girl. The other children moved back, giving her space. Her drawing was different. It was not abstract. It was specific. She drew next to the spiral sun. She drew two figures, a man and a woman, but she drew them intertwined, merged, two bodies sharing a single head. She drew this figure, this two-souled creature, at the very beginning of the spiral, the origin point. Then she drew other things. She drew the cabin, but she drew it with a tree growing through the center of it, a massive, ancient tree, its branches forming the roof, its roots the foundation. She drew the four-winged bird from the mantelpiece. She drew it flying above the two-souled creature, like a dark angel, or a vulture. Her final drawing was the most disturbing. She drew a series of small, stick-like figures, but she drew them lying down, outside the cabin. She drew them in a long, neat row, like firewood. She drew many of them, dozens, and over them she drew patterns of leaves, as if they were being buried, or returned to the earth. When she finished, she put the charcoal down. She looked at Dr. Whitmore. Her pale eyes were not blank, not this time. There was a glimmer of something in them, a challenge, a statement. This is who we are. This is where we come from. Dr. Whitmore felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's damp air. He was a man of science. He believed in observable phenomena, but this drawing felt like something else. It felt like mythology, a creation story, a story of a monstrous beginning, a story of cyclical death. He realized he was not just studying a family, he was studying a religion with 13 followers and one silent, patient God. Back in Sedalia, the doctor stared at the drawing for hours. It was spread across his small motel room bed. he saw the story it told. A story of a founding pair, locked in an inseparable union, of a lineage that did not branch, but spiraled inward. A story of outsiders who came and were absorbed, composted, the stick figures lying in a row. They were not family members who had died. They were strangers, travelers, surveyors. He thought of Arthur Penn. He pictured him, with his straight lines and his logical mind, trying to comprehend this place. He imagined him being pulled into the spiral. His neatly folded tripod was a trophy, his notebook a relic. The doctor knew he was at a crossroads. He had two choices. He could present this drawing and his interpretation of it to Administrator Thompson. It would be seen as proof of their savagery. It would confirm the administrator's worst fears. It would unleash the full, clumsy force of the state upon this fragile, dangerous world. They would be rounded up, studied like animals. Their home would be destroyed. Their religion would be broken. Or he could do something else. He could lie. He could write a report that was technically true, but emotionally false. He could describe them as a harmless, albeit unusual, family of isolated homesteaders. He could omit the drawing. He could omit the clicking song. He could omit the feeling of a collective mind watching his every move. He could recommend that they be left alone, that their land be designated as a protected area, that they be allowed to continue their strange, silent existence. It was a profound moral dilemma. To protect them was to condemn any future wanderer who might stumble upon them. To rescue them was to destroy the only world they had ever known, a world that was, in its own way, complete, perfect. He looked at the drawing of the two-souled creature, the founder, the beginning. He thought of the biblical story of Adam and Eve, but this was a different Eden, a darker Eden. Here, the serpent had 4 wings, and the apple of knowledge was a thing to be feared. He realized with a jolt that the children were not the real anomaly. They were the consequence. The real anomaly was the cabin, the forest itself, the spiral. It was a place that did not want to be found, a place that corrected any intrusion. The next morning, he went to the administrator's office. He carried a thin file. His official report. He had made his decision. He had chosen to lie. He had chosen to become a different kind of gatekeeper. He sat across from Administrator Thompson. He explained, in calm, clinical terms, that the family was a unique cultural remnant. He said they posed no threat as long as they were not provoked. He used words like ethnobiology and non-invasive observation. He recommended the area be sealed off, not for the public's safety, but for the families, to preserve their way of life. The administrator was relieved. This was a solution he could understand. It was paperwork. It was drawing a new line on a map, a line that cordoned off the problem. He thanked the doctor for his professionalism. He said the state would follow his recommendations. Sheriff Brody was there. He listened to the doctor's report. He knew it was a lie. He could see it in the doctor's eyes. He saw the things the doctor was not saying. He saw the drawing of the spiral that was not in the file. He did not say a word. He understood the choice the doctor had made. He had chosen the lesser of 2 evils, or perhaps the more elegant of 2 horrors. As Dr. Whitmore left the office, he felt a strange sense of complicity. He had looked into the abyss, and instead of fighting it, he had built a wall around it. He had left the 13 children to their silent God and their spiraling world. He told himself it was the right thing to do, the humane thing to do. But that night, in his motel room, he could not sleep. He kept thinking of the final part of the drawing, the neat rows of stick figures, the outsiders. He had saved the family, but he had also saved the cabin's hungry secret. He had become a part of the system, a silent accomplice. And he wondered, as he stared into the darkness, how many more stick figures would be added to the drawing, how many more men like Arthur Penn would be absorbed by the quiet, patient forest. The report was filed, the case was closed, but the spiral was still turning. For 15 years, the lie held. The area around the cabin was designated a state biological preserve. Fences were not erected, that would have drawn attention. Instead, access roads were quietly rerouted. Old logging trails were allowed to become overgrown. On maps, the area was marked with the impenetrable green of protected state land. The story of the lost surveyor, Arthur Penn, faded into a sad but simple local tale of a man swallowed by the wilderness. The cabin and its inhabitants were officially forgotten. Dr. Harold Whitmore went back to his university. He never published his true findings. The charcoal drawing remained locked in a private safe. Sometimes late at night in his study, he would take it out. He would trace the lines with his finger, the two-souled founder, the tree growing through the house, the rows of the consumed. It was a constant, quiet reminder of the deal he had made. He had walled off a mystery, and in doing so, had become its sole custodian. His lie was a dam holding back a terrible flood. Sheriff Brody retired 5 years later. He never spoke of the cabin again, not to his wife, not to his deputies, but the memory of it settled deep in his bones. He would sometimes drive to the edge of the new preserve. He would park his truck and look into the dense, silent woods. He could feel the place, a cold spot on the landscape. He wondered if the children were still there, if they had grown, if the spiral had continued. He knew the doctor's lie was an act of mercy, but he also knew that mercy and ignorance were often the same thing. The world moved on. The 1950s gave way to the 60s. The quiet hills of Appalachia heard the distant echoes of a changing nation, but in the deep, forgotten holler, time did not pass. It circled. In the autumn of 1966, a new sound came to the woods. The sound of helicopters. The United States Army Corps of Engineers had been tasked with a new project. A series of dams to control flooding along the river basin. A project that had been planned years before, in an office hundreds of miles away. A project that would put a new lake right in the heart of the so-called biological preserve. Bureaucracy, unlike memory, is relentless. A new set of surveyors arrived, young men with new equipment. They had laser transits and aerial photographs. They did not carry the old maps with the blank spaces. Their maps were detailed, precise, and their maps showed a structure, an anomaly, right where the deepest part of the new reservoir was planned to be. A notice was sent to the county administrator's office in Sedalia. A new man held the position now. He found the old file from 1951, the file with Dr. Whitmore's carefully constructed lie. He read the report. It described a small, isolated family, harmless, living a primitive existence. The report recommended they be left alone. But the dam project was a federal priority. It had momentum. It had millions of dollars behind it. The family could not be left alone. They had to be moved. The administrator, a man of efficiency and process, saw it as a simple relocation issue, a social services matter. He sent a letter to Dr. Harold Whitmore, who was now a department head at the university. The letter informed him that, due to the dam project, the isolated family he had studied would need to be relocated. It asked for his assistance in the matter. When Dr. Whitmore received the letter, he felt a cold dread he had not felt in 15 years. The dam he had built was about to break. He knew what would happen. A team of social workers and state troopers would be sent to the cabin. They would not come with offerings of kaleidoscopes and music boxes. They would come with paperwork and authority. They would see the 13, now fully grown, products of the spiral. They would see the wrongness. They would react with fear and force. The result would be a tragedy, a bloody, chaotic clash between two worlds that could not coexist. He had to get there first. He tried to call the administrator, to explain the danger, but his warnings were dismissed as academic sentimentality. The project was moving forward. The family had to be moved. It was the law. Dr. Whitmore knew he had only one option. He had to go back, alone. He had to try to reason with them, to explain what was coming. It was a fool's errand. How do you explain eminent domain to a hive mind that communicates through mythology and silence? He drove to Sedalia. He was an old man now. His tweed jacket was frayed. His hands trembled slightly. He found the new sheriff, a young man who had no knowledge of the old story. The doctor did not try to explain. He simply asked for a vehicle and directions to the edge of the preserve. He also made one other stop. He visited the retired Sheriff Brody. He found Brody sitting on his porch, looking at the hills. The old sheriff was not surprised to see him. It was as if he had been waiting for 15 years. The doctor explained the situation. The dam, the relocation. Brody listened, his face grim. He nodded slowly. He said he knew this day would come. He said you cannot hide a thing like that forever. He said the woods have a way of calling people back. Dr. Whitmore asked Brody to come with him, for his own safety, but the old man refused. He said his time in that place was done. He said some doors are only meant to be opened once. But he gave the doctor a piece of advice. He told him not to trust the silence. He said the silence was how they thought. The doctor drove to the edge of the preserve. The woods were thicker now. The path he had once walked with the sheriff and the tracker was gone, erased by 15 years of growth. He pushed his way through the underbrush. He was clumsy. He was old. The forest resisted him. After 2 hours, he was lost. He sat on a fallen log, his heart pounding in his chest. He was a fool, a man of books and theories, lost in a world of instinct and shadow. As he sat there, catching his breath, he saw movement, a flash of pale color in the deep green. A figure was standing 50 yards away, watching him. It was one of them. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s. He had the same lank, straw-colored hair, the same wide, empty eyes, the same face as all the others, a face that had not changed. The young man did not move. He just stood there, waiting. Dr. Whitmore knew he was not a threat. He was a guide, an escort. He stood up. He followed. The young man moved through the forest with a liquid grace. He made no sound. He led the doctor on a winding, circuitous path, a path that did not exist on any map. Finally, they came to the clearing. The cabin was still there, but it had changed. It seemed to have sunk deeper into the earth. The moss on the roof was thicker. The stones of the chimney were darker. It looked less like a structure and more like a geological formation. And the family was there, all 13 of them. They were standing outside the cabin, in a single, straight line, facing him. They were no longer children. They were adults. 13 identical adults. The small boy, the catalyst, was now a man. The tall mother-sister was a woman whose age was impossible to guess. She stood in the center of the line. Her authority was absolute. They were not holding tools. They were not holding weapons. They were just standing, waiting for him. They knew he was coming. They knew why he was here. The doctor felt a wave of despair. He had come to warn them of the modern world. But the modern world did not exist here. He was the one who was out of place. An alien, a ghost from a forgotten time. He had come to save them. But he realized, with a terrible final clarity, that they did not need saving. They had their own solution, their own way of dealing with intruders, their own way of turning a problem into a story, drawn in charcoal, on a piece of paper that no one would ever see. Their own way of dealing with intruders, their own way of turning a problem into a story, drawn in charcoal, on a piece of paper that no one would ever see. Dr. Whitmore stopped at the edge of the clearing. The air was heavy. The silence was not empty. It was a presence, a pressure against his eardrums. The 13 figures did not move. Their pale faces were turned towards him. Their identical, slightly drooping eyelids gave them an expression of ancient boredom, as if they had seen this exact scene play out 1,000 times before. He had prepared a speech on the drive up. Words about the government, about progress, about the unstoppable force of the dam. He had planned to be gentle, persuasive. Now, standing before them, the words felt like dust in his mouth. They were a language from another planet, meaningless. He took a step forward. His dress shoes, so out of place here, sank into the soft earth. He raised a hand, a gesture of peace, the same gesture he had used on the door 15 years ago. It was the mother-sister who responded. She took one step forward, detaching herself from the line. Her movement was slow, deliberate. She was not a woman in any conventional sense. She was an icon, a physical manifestation of the place itself. She tilted her head, a gesture he remembered from the catalyst child all those years ago. It was a look of clinical curiosity. The way a scientist might observe a beetle twitching on a pin. The doctor opened his mouth. He had to say something. To try. He spoke her name. Not a name she had ever been given, but the one he had written in his secret notes, Yuli. He had taken it from an obscure folk tale about a woman who lived in the hollow of a tree. The sound of his voice was a violation. It ripped through the sacred silence of the clearing. The moment the name left his lips, the 13 figures reacted. They did not speak. They did not attack. They simply made the sound, the low, clicking rattle, deep in their throats. A chorus of 13, perfectly synchronized. It was louder than he remembered, deeper. It was the sound of the earth clearing its throat, the sound of stone grinding against stone. The doctor stumbled back, his hand flying to his chest. The sound was not just auditory. It was a physical force. It vibrated in his bones. It blurred his vision. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to warp and sway. The faces of the family began to blur together, their 13 separate forms dissolving into a single, pale, undulating wave of flesh. He remembered Sheriff Brody's warning, "Do not trust the silence. The silence is how they think." This sound was the opposite of silence. It was the result of their thought. It was their verdict. He had to get away. He turned to run, but his legs would not obey. He was paralyzed, not by fear, but by the sound. It was breaking him down, deconstructing him. peeling away the layers of his identity. Professor, doctor, man. All of it was dissolving into the vibrating air. Through the shimmering haze, he saw two of the men detach from the line. They were the ones who looked to be in their early 20s. They moved with the same fluid grace as the guide who had led him here. They walked towards him. They did not run. They did not need to. He was rooted to the spot. They stopped on either side of him. He could feel their body heat. He could smell the familiar scent of wood smoke and damp earth. They each took one of his arms. Their grip was not violent. It was firm, impersonal, like a nurse preparing a patient for a procedure. They began to walk him towards the cabin. His feet dragged through the dirt. He was a doll being carried. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and reason, was a ruin. The clicking sound had subsided, but echoes of it still rattled in his skull. They led him to the door. It was open. The darkness inside was absolute. It seemed to exhale a cold, musty breath. This was it. This was the end of the spiral. He was the next stick figure to be laid in a neat row. He thought of Arthur Penn. He wondered if this was how it had happened for him. Had he been led, unresisting, into the quiet dark? But they did not take him inside. They stopped at the threshold. They turned him around, so he was facing the clearing, so he could see the other 11 figures. They were still in a line, still watching. The mother sister, Uli, walked towards him. She held something in her hand. It was a piece of charcoal, the same kind he had brought them 15 years ago. She stopped in front of him. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he saw something there beyond the blankness. He saw a flicker of understanding, not of his world, but of his role in theirs. He was not just an intruder. He was part of their story now, the man who had come and then returned, the one who had brought them the gift of color and light, the one who had built a wall to protect them, and now, the one who had come to warn them of the wall's collapse. She raised her hand. With the charcoal, she drew a single, clean line on his forehead, from the hairline to the bridge of his nose. It was a mark of designation. He had been chosen. Then she spoke. Her voice was not the clicking rattle. It was a human voice, but it was ancient, rusty from disuse. It was like the creak of a door that had not been opened in a century. She spoke one word, a word that was both a question and a command. Show. They turned him back towards the cabin. They guided him inside. The interior was the same, the packed earth floor, the stone hearth, the piles of straw. But there was something new. Against the far wall, where there had once been only bare wood, there were drawings. Dozens of them, all done in charcoal, a vast, sprawling mural of their history. His eyes struggled to adjust to the gloom, but he could make out the images. It was the story from the paper, magnified 100 times. There was the spiral, the two-souled founder, the tree, the four-winged bird. But now, there was more. The story continued. He saw a drawing of a man with straight lines and sharp angles, holding a tripod. Arthur Penn. He was drawn standing at the edge of the spiral, looking in. In the next panel, he was part of the spiral, absorbed. Then, the doctor saw himself, a small, tidy figure in a tweed jacket. He was drawn holding out a kaleidoscope. He was shown sitting on the floor with them. In the next panel, he was drawing a wall around the cabin, a wall of trees, protecting them. He was a figure in their mythology, the guardian, the keeper of the wall. They led him to a blank space on the wall. The mother sister put the charcoal in his hand. Her fingers were cold. He understood. This was not an execution. It was a test, a final exam. He had lied to his world to protect theirs. Now, he had to show them what was coming. He had to add the next chapter to their story. His hand trembled. He looked at the wall. He was a man of words, of reports and theories. But here, words were useless. Only pictures mattered. Only the story. He began to draw. He drew the helicopters, the men with their laser transits. He drew the massive concrete curve of the dam. He drew water, a great flood rising to swallow the cabin, to swallow the clearing, to swallow their entire world. He drew it as best he could. His lines were clumsy, childlike, but the meaning was clear. Annihilation, the end of the spiral. He drew until his arm ached. When he was finished, he stepped back. The 13 figures were gathered behind him, their shadows long in the dim light. They looked at his drawing. They looked at the wall. They were reading. There was a long, deep silence. The silence of comprehension. The mother-sister stepped forward. She touched the drawing of the dam. She traced the line of the rising water. She looked at the doctor. The mark on his forehead felt heavy. She turned to her family, and she began to make the sound, the clicking. But it was different this time. It was not an attack. It was a conversation. A rapid, complex series of clicks and rattles. A debate. The others responded in kind. The cabin was filled with the sound of their silent language. It was the sound of a hive deciding its future. Dr. Whitmore stood among them, a ghost at a family meeting. He had delivered his message. He had told their story. Now, all he could do was wait for their reply. He had no idea if they would flee, or fight, or simply wait for the water to claim them. He had opened the door 15 years ago. Now, he had shown them the flood that was coming to pour through it. He had done all he could. The rest was up to them, and to the strange, silent God that lived behind their eyes. The clicking debate lasted for what felt like an hour. The air in the cabin was thick with it. It rose and fell in complex cadences. It was a storm of pure, unadulterated thought. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, a forgotten relic in the eye of the hurricane. He was no longer the subject. He was merely a witness to their process, a process as alien and inexorable as erosion. Finally, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, complete. It was the silence of a decision made. The 13 figures turned as one. They were no longer looking at the drawing on the wall. They were looking at him. The mother sister, Uli, stepped forward. The charcoal mark on the doctor's forehead felt like a brand. She reached out and took his arm. Her grip was gentle but firm. She led him out of the cabin, back into the gray light of the clearing. The other 12 followed, forming a silent procession behind them. They did not lead him back the way he had come. They led him to the far side of the clearing, to a part of the woods he had never seen. The trees here were older, thicker. Their branches were heavy with moss, and they blotted out the sky. It was a dark, primeval place. The air was cold and still. They stopped before a massive ancient oak. It was a giant. Its trunk was wider than a car. Its bark was a gnarled, twisted landscape of its own. At the base of the tree, there was an opening. A dark hollow, large enough for a man to crawl into. It was not a wound in the tree. It looked like a natural doorway, as if the tree had grown around a space, deliberately leaving it open. The doctor stared at the opening. He thought of the drawing on the cabin wall, the tree growing through the house, the foundation, the origin. This was it. This was the heart of the spiral. Uli led him to the opening. She knelt and gestured for him to do the same. Her face was calm. Her eyes were clear. There was no malice in them, only purpose. She pointed into the darkness of the hollow. He peered inside. He could see nothing at first, just a deep, earthy blackness. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw that the hollow was not empty. It was filled with objects. They were arranged in neat, careful rows. He saw Arthur Penn's compass, glinting dully in the faint light. He saw a rusty pocket knife, a tarnished silver locket, a child's small leather shoe, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, one lens cracked, a metal button from a uniform. They were the relics, the indigestible pieces of the outsiders who had been absorbed, the bones coughed up by the forest. This was their tomb, their archive. At the very back of the hollow, almost lost in the shadow, was something else. It was a book, an old, leather-bound ledger. It was worn and water-stained, but intact. Uli reached into the hollow. She retrieved the book. Her movements were reverent. She handed it to the doctor. He took it. The leather was cold and supple. It was heavy. He opened it. The first page was a property deed, dated 1832. It listed the sale of this tract of land to a man named Jedediah Kane. The pages that followed were a journal. The handwriting was tight, manic. It was a chronicle of madness. Jedediah Kane had come to these woods seeking solitude. He had come with his sister. The journal spoke of visions, of a song in the earth, of a voice that whispered from the roots of the trees. It spoke of a desire to become one with the woods, to shed the skin of the world. The last entry was brief. It read, "We are two, but the tree has made us one. The spiral has begun." Dr. Whitmore looked up from the book. He looked at Uli. He finally understood. They were not the children of Cain. They were the children of the place, of the tree. Cain and his sister were just the first to answer the call, the first to be absorbed. The two-souled founder in the drawing, he had believed he was studying a family, a product of inbreeding and isolation. He was wrong. He was studying a non-human intelligence, an ancient, patient organism that wore human faces like a mask, an entity that budded and reproduced, stamping each new vessel with the same flawed features: the drooping eyelid, the long fingers, the pale, colorless eyes. These were not deformities. They were a trademark, the signature of the artist. The family, he realized, was a lure, a human-shaped web to draw in the curious, the lost, the compassionate, to draw in men like Arthur Penn, to draw in men like himself. Uli pointed to the book, then she pointed to him, then she pointed down the hill, in the direction of the outside world. The message was clear: take it, go, show them. This was their answer. They were not going to run, they were not going to fight. They were giving him their sacred text, their Bible. They were sending him back into the world as their prophet, their witness. They knew the dam was coming, they knew the water would rise, but the book was their seed, their story, and he was to be the one to plant it. They were sacrificing the cabin, their physical form, to ensure the survival of their idea, of their spiral. They were letting him go. The two young men who had escorted him before now stood on either side of him again. They turned him away from the great oak tree. They began to lead him back through the woods. The other 11, with Yuli at their head, remained by the tree. They watched him go. They did not wave, they did not speak. They simply stood, a silent congregation, as their chosen apostle began his journey. The walk back was a blur. The doctor clutched the heavy ledger to his chest. It felt both cold and hot, a thing of immense power. The two young men guided him with an unerring sense of direction. They moved through the dense woods as if walking down a hallway. They did not speak to him. They did not look at him. They were simply an escort. They led him to the edge of the preserve, to the spot where his car was parked. They stopped at the tree line. They would go no further. They had delivered him to the border of his world. Their task was done. They turned, and without a backward glance, melted back into the trees. Dr. Whitmore was alone. He was splattered with mud. His clothes were torn. He had a charcoal line drawn on his forehead, and he was holding a book that rewrote the history of a small, forgotten piece of Appalachia. He got into his car. He placed the ledger on the passenger seat. He started the engine. The sound was violent in the quiet woods. He drove away. He did not look in the rearview mirror. He knew what he would see. Just trees. An impenetrable wall of green. But he could feel them. He could feel their 13 pairs of eyes. Their collective consciousness, watching him. Following him, he was no longer their guardian. He was their instrument. He did not know what he would do. Who would believe him? The story in the ledger was a story of impossible horror, of a sentient landscape that consumed people. It was the stuff of nightmares, not academic journals. If he showed it to the authorities, they would think him insane. They would lock him away, and the dam project would continue. He drove for hours. The sun began to set. He was driving back towards the world of straight lines and logical conclusions. But he was no longer a part of it. He had a foot in two worlds, and he was carrying a message from one to the other. He thought about the dam, the rising water, the cabin being slowly submerged. He thought of the 13 figures, standing silently as the flood came, and he realized their plan was one of terrible, patient genius. The water would not destroy them. It would protect them. It would create a new, deeper isolation. It would seal their holy place under 100 feet of dark, still water. It would make it inaccessible, a legend, a story of a town drowned to make a lake. And the book he held in his hands, it was not a warning, it was an invitation, a map, for the next person who was ready to hear the song in the earth. The spiral was not ending. It was just going dormant, waiting. He was its caretaker, its librarian. He had to protect the story, until the water receded, until the time was right for the spiral to begin again. He looked at the book on the seat beside him. It was his burden now, and his curse. He did not go back to the university. He did not go to the authorities. He drove to a small, sleepy town on the coast, a place where no one knew his name. He used the last of his money to rent a small, damp room above a bait shop. The air smelled of salt and decay. It was a fitting place to become a ghost. He locked the door. He sat at a rickety wooden table. He placed the ledger before him. For days, he did nothing but read. He traced Jedediah Kane's frantic, spidery handwriting. He absorbed the story of the descent. The sister, whose name was Lilith, was not a willing participant. The journal described her fear, her attempts to flee, but the woods and Jedediah would not let her go. She was the first sacrifice, the unwilling Eve to his mad Adam. The ledger was not just a journal. After Jedediah's final entry, the pages continued, but the handwriting changed. It became a crude, pictorial record, the same style as the drawings on the cabin wall. It was a logbook, a record of acquisitions. Each new entry was a simple drawing, a sketch of a person, a traveler, a lost hunter, a runaway. Next to each sketch was a drawing of an item, a compass, a locket, a boot. It was a visual inventory of the people the place had consumed, a history of its hunger. The last entry was a crude but unmistakable drawing of a man with a surveying tripod. Arthur Penn. There was a blank page after his, a space waiting to be filled. Dr. Whitmore understood. This book was the core of their memory, the one thing that could not be replaced. His mission was not just to save the story, it was to continue it. He lived in that small, rented room for weeks. He let his beard grow. He grew thin. His eyes took on a wild, haunted look. He was becoming a man of the ledger. He spoke to no one. He only left the room to buy bread and coffee. The rest of the time, he sat with the book. It was his only companion. He followed the news of the dam project in the local papers. The articles were small, buried in the back pages. They spoke of progress, of deadlines being met. They mentioned the successful and humane relocation of the area's sparse wildlife. There was no mention of a family, no mention of a cabin. The lie he had told 15 years ago had done its work too well. He and the 13 had been erased from the official record. One day, he read a short article that made his blood run cold. It was about the final clearing of the valley before the floodgates were closed. The foreman of the logging crew reported a strange discovery: an old, dilapidated cabin deep in the woods. The article treated it as a curiosity. It said the structure was so old it was considered unsafe. It was scheduled for demolition, burned to the ground as per state protocol for abandoned structures in a flood zone. They were going to burn the library. He had to do something. He had to save the drawings on the wall. They were the original manuscript. The ledger was just a copy. He left the room. He got in his car. He drove for 2 days, fueled by black coffee and a terrifying, clarifying purpose. He arrived back in the hills of Appalachia at night. He parked his car on a dirt road, miles from the dam project. He could hear the distant roar of heavy machinery. He could see the glow of massive floodlights against the clouds. The air was filled with the smell of diesel and cut pine. He took the ledger with him. He wrapped it in an oilcloth to protect it from the damp. He walked into the woods. He did not know the way, not really. But he walked with a strange sense of confidence. He was following a call, a pull. The place was guiding him home. After hours of walking, he found it. The clearing. It was a scene of violation. The trees around the edge had been torn down. The ground was scarred with the tracks of heavy machinery. But the cabin was still standing. A dark, silent survivor in a field of destruction. A demolition crew's red plastic tape was stretched across the doorway. A warning. He tore the tape away. He stepped inside. The cabin was cold and empty. They were gone. There was no sign that they had ever been there. Except for the drawings, the mural was still there. A silent, sprawling testament on the walls. He had no camera. He had no way to copy the images. He could only do one thing. He had to save them from the fire. He had to take the walls themselves. He spent the rest of the night in a frenzy of desperate labor. Using a rusty tire iron he found in the trunk of his car, he began to pry the old planks from the cabin's interior frame. The wood was ancient, brittle. It groaned and splintered. It was a work of desecration. He was dismantling his own church, but it was the only way. He worked until his hands were raw and bleeding. One by one, he freed the planks that held the charcoal story. He carried them out of the cabin and hid them in a thicket of rhododendron bushes. The drawing of the two-souled founder, the spiral, the story of Arthur Penn, his own story as the guardian. He saved them all. As dawn broke, he heard the sound of trucks approaching. The demolition crew. He hid in the bushes, his heart pounding. He watched as a group of men in hard hats and bright vests approached the cabin. They laughed and drank coffee. To them, it was just another job, an old shack to be burned. They doused the cabin in gasoline. One of the men tossed a lit flare. The structure went up with a roar. The old, dry wood caught instantly. The fire was hot and violent. It consumed the cabin in minutes. It erased the last physical trace of the family, the last evidence that anything strange had ever happened in these woods. The crew did not stay long. They watched it burn to the foundation, then they left. Dr. Whitmore waited until their trucks were gone. He waited until the fire had died down to a bed of glowing embers. He stepped out of his hiding place. He looked at the smoking ruin. Nothing was left. He spent the rest of the day ferrying the heavy, charcoal-marked planks back to his car. It took him hours. Each trip was an agony of exhaustion. But he did it. He loaded the sacred texts into the trunk and the back seat of his car. He was about to leave when he felt a pull. A final call. He walked back to the burned foundation one last time. He stood where the center of the room had been. He looked down. The fire had burned away the dirt floor, and in doing so, it had revealed something. Sticking out of the scorched earth was the corner of a small metal box. He knelt. He dug at the hot earth with his bare, bleeding hands. He unearthed the box. It was an old army surplus ammunition can. It was rusted but intact. He forced the latch open. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried moss, were 13 small, smooth stones. And one other object, a single, unchanging photograph. It was a daguerreotype. Faded and spotted with age, it showed a man and a woman standing stiffly before a new, rough-hewn cabin. The man was Jedediah Kane, the woman, his sister Lilith. They were not identical. They were not flawed. They were just two people staring out from the past. But behind them, in the dark doorway of the cabin, almost lost in the shadow, was a third figure, a tall, indistinct shape. It had no face. It just was. The doctor realized the truth. Kane and his sister were not the founders. They were just the first tenants. The place itself, the entity, had been there long before, waiting. He looked from the photograph to the smoldering ruins. He had saved the story, but he had missed the first chapter, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the story was not over. The flood was coming. But a flood, like a fire, can reveal as much as it conceals. Dr. Whitmore drove away from the ruins of the cabin with a car full of ghosts. The charcoal-marked planks were a silent congregation in his back seat. The ledger of Jedediah Kane sat beside him. The ammunition box with its stones and its terrible photograph was on the floor. He was no longer a doctor or a professor. He was an archivist of the abyss, the sole curator of a museum of horrors. He drove without a destination, a fugitive from a world that would never understand. He ended up in a small, forgotten town in the industrial wreckage of northern Pennsylvania. He rented a small house on a dead-end street. It was a place where people did not ask questions, a place to disappear. He converted the garage into a sanctuary. He carefully mounted the scorched planks on the walls, reassembling the mural in its correct, sprawling order. He set up a single desk and a chair. He placed the ledger, the ammunition box, and the photograph on the desk. He spent his days in that garage, surrounded by the story. The silence was as profound as it had been in the cabin. The charcoal figures watched him. The spiral drew him in. The news of the dam's completion came a few months later. A triumphant article in a national magazine, complete with aerial photographs of the new, pristine lake. It was named Lake Thompson, after the county administrator who had overseen the early stages of the project, a monument to bureaucratic efficiency. The doctor looked at the glossy pictures of the deep blue water. He knew what lay beneath, the foundation of the cabin, the great oak tree with its hollow heart, the land that had been consecrated by a century of absorbed lives. The water was a lid on a coffin, a seal on a tomb. He lived this way for years, a hermit in a garage full of secrets. He ate little, he slept less. His health began to fail. His mind, once so sharp and analytical, began to soften, to fray at the edges. The line between his own thoughts and the story on the walls grew thin. He would have long, one-sided conversations with the figure of the guardian he had drawn so long ago. He would trace the lines of the four-winged bird, whispering questions to it. He was being absorbed, just as surely as Arthur Penn had been, slowly, methodically. His only contact with the outside world was with old Sheriff Brody. Once a year, the doctor would drive to a payphone in a neighboring town and call him. He never said where he was. He would just ask a single question. Is the water still high? And Brody, his voice thin and reedy with age, would always give the same answer. The water is high. It was their liturgy, their shared secret, a confirmation that the dam was holding, that the monster was still sleeping. One year, there was a drought, the worst in a century. The articles in the paper spoke of a crisis. Rivers turned to trickles, crops failed, and the water level in Lake Thompson began to drop. At first, it was a few feet, then 10, then 20. Old roadbeds and forgotten stone walls began to emerge from the receding shoreline, like the bones of a half-remembered dream. The doctor watched the news reports with a growing sense of terror and exhilaration. He called Sheriff Brody. "Is the water still high?" he asked, his voice trembling. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Brody spoke, his voice a dry whisper. "The water is falling," he said. "They say an old church steeple is visible now, on the north shore." Then the old sheriff said something else. "I think it's time, Doctor. The story wants to be told." The doctor hung up the phone. He knew Brody was right. The dormancy was ending. The tomb was unsealing. He went back to his garage. He looked at the mural. He looked at the ledger. He knew he was too old and too weak to be the prophet they had chosen. He could not carry the story back into the world, but he could prepare the way. He spent the next week writing. He wrote everything down. His first visit to the cabin, the lie he told, the charcoal drawing on the paper, his final, terrible visit, the book of Jedediah Cain, the photograph. He wrote it all down in a clear, steady hand. He was a scientist again, documenting, observing. He created a complete and irrefutable record, a user's manual for the horror. When he was finished, he put his manuscript, the ledger, and the photograph into the ammunition box. He sealed it shut. He took one last look at the mural on the walls. The story was all there. He was just a footnote. He got in his car. He drove back to Sedalia. The town had changed. It was bigger now, busier. The lake had brought tourism, a new prosperity. He drove through the town, a ghost visiting his own past. He drove up to the old sheriff's house, but there was a new family living there. A neighbor told him that Sheriff Brody had passed away a few months earlier. The doctor was truly alone now, the last keeper of the secret. He drove out to the lake. The shoreline had receded dramatically. A wide, muddy beach separated the road from the water, and out in the middle of the lake, an island had appeared. A small, muddy hillock, crowned with the skeletal branches of a single, massive tree, the great oak, the heart of the spiral. It had been there all along, waiting. He knew what he had to do. That night, under the light of a full moon, he rented a small fishing boat. He rowed out onto the dark, still water. He rowed towards the island. The silence was profound. The air was cold. As he got closer, he saw that the island was not just mud. It was littered with debris, old, blackened timbers, the foundation stones of the cabin. The fire and the flood had not erased the place. They had distilled it. He beached the small boat on the muddy shore. He carried the heavy ammunition box with him. He climbed the small hill to the base of the great oak. The hollow doorway was there. It was filled with mud and stagnant water. He stood before it, the last priest of a forgotten religion. He had one final act to perform. He was not a prophet. He was a delivery man. He was returning the story to its source. He opened the ammunition box. He took out his manuscript. He took out the ledger. He took out the photograph. He placed them inside the hollow of the tree, pushing them deep into the mud and the dark water. The story was home. He kept only one thing, the 13 small, smooth stones. He got back in the boat. He rowed to the deepest part of the lake. He took the stones out of his pocket. He held them in his hand. They were cold and heavy. They felt ancient. He thought of the 13 figures, the hive, the single organism in its many bodies. He wondered where they had gone, if they had simply walked away into the world. 13 identical faces, dissolving into the crowds, or if they were waiting. He let the stones fall from his hand. They dropped into the dark water, one by one. They made no sound. They were an offering, a final prayer. His work was done. He had carried the burden. He had kept the faith. The story was safe, waiting for the water to fall further, waiting for a new surveyor, a new hunter, a new curious soul to find the island, to look into the hollow of the tree, to find the book, to begin the spiral anew. Dr. Harold Whitmore rowed back to the shore. He left the boat on the beach. He walked to his car. He drove away from Lake Thompson. He did not look back. He was an empty vessel now. The story was no longer inside him. He felt a strange sense of peace, a sense of release. He had been the guardian, and now his watch was over. He drove until the sun came up. He was just an old man in a car, nothing more. But the story once told does not like to be abandoned. It leaves an echo, a stain. Dr. Whitmore drove until he ran out of gas, in a town whose name he did not know. He left the car by the side of the road. He walked. He had no destination. He was just unwinding the clock. He ended up in a state-run nursing facility. He had no money, no identification. He gave them a false name. He was a quiet resident, a ghost in a wheelchair, staring out the window. The other residents left him alone. There was a coldness around him, a stillness that made them uneasy. The nurses said he had dementia. They said his mind was gone. They were wrong. His mind was clearer than it had ever been. He was no longer cluttered with the details of the story. He had delivered it back to its source. But the structure remained. The shape of the spiral, the rhythm of the hive. He could feel it, a low hum, just beneath the noise of the world. He did not speak for the last 2 years of his life. He had no need for words. He watched. He listened. He saw the patterns, the way the residents in the facility moved in groups, the way a single idea or mood could flash through a room without a word being spoken. He saw the drooping eyelid of a nurse, the long, slender fingers of an orderly. He saw the trademark, the signature. The spiral was not just in the deep woods of Appalachia, it was everywhere, a dormant seed, waiting for the right conditions. He died on a Tuesday, quietly, in his sleep. No one came to his funeral. He was buried in a pauper's grave, his false name on a small metal marker. The last human witness was gone. The story was now truly on its own. Years passed. The drought broke. The waters of Lake Thompson rose again, hiding the island. The world moved on. The story slept, but a seed is a patient thing. In 2017, a young urban historian named Clara Evans became obsessed with the history of the dam projects of the 1960s. She was writing her doctoral thesis on the drowned towns of America, the places and communities erased by the march of progress. She was meticulous. She spent months in state archives, digging through dusty boxes of government records. It was there that she found the first thread, a discrepancy in the planning documents for the Lake Thompson Reservoir. An original survey map, dated 1951, showed a large, blank area designated uninhabited. A later map, from 1966, had a small, hand-drawn circle in the same area, with a single, scribbled word next to it: anomaly. Clara was intrigued. It was a breadcrumb, a loose thread in an otherwise tidy narrative. She searched for the name of the original surveyor, Arthur Penn. She found the official report, lost in the wilderness, presumed deceased. But she also found a file she was not supposed to see, a sealed psychiatric evaluation of the county administrator at the time, Reginald Thompson, conducted 2 years after the surveyor's disappearance. It described his obsessive fear of a clicking sound and his recurring nightmares of a dozen empty faces, all the same. The evaluation concluded he was suffering from job-related stress. Clara knew she had found something. She dug deeper. She found the name of the man who led the search party, Sheriff Brody, then the name of the specialist he had called in, Dr. Harold Whitmore. She found the doctor's official sanitized report. It was a dead end, a tidy lie. But Clara was a new kind of historian. She did not just rely on official records. She searched old newspaper archives, online genealogy forums. She searched for any mention of Whitmore. She found his academic publications. All of them stopped abruptly in 1966. It was as if he had ceased to exist. She found his last known address, the small house in Pennsylvania. She drove there. The house was abandoned. The garage was empty. But on the dusty concrete floor, she found faint marks, the outlines of where the planks had been mounted, and in a crack in the floor, she found a single, small, smooth stone. The trail had gone cold. Clara was about to give up, to dismiss it as another unsolved local mystery. But then she had an idea, a long shot. She searched for patient records from state-run nursing facilities, looking for men who matched the doctor's age and description, who had been admitted around the time he disappeared. She found him, admitted under a false name, deceased. But the admission file contained a small, personal effects envelope. Inside was a single object, a key to a pay-by-the-week motel room in a town on the coast, a room that had been paid for, in cash, for 50 years. Through a lawyer's trust that had been set up anonymously, Clara went to the motel. The manager, an old man who had inherited the business from his father, remembered the stories of the strange, silent man who had lived in that room for a few weeks, half a century ago. The room had been kept locked, as per the trust's instructions. He unlocked it for her. The room was a time capsule. It was empty, except for a single, deep scratch in the wooden floor, a perfect spiral. Clara stood in the center of the room. She felt a strange sense of resonance, of an old story waiting to be read. She knew the answer was not in the archives. It was not in the room. It was in the place where it all began. She went to Lake Thompson. She rented a boat. She had a new piece of equipment the old doctor did not, a side-scan sonar. She spent a week on the lake, mapping the bottom. She found the old church, the drowned roads, the stone walls, and then she found it. In the deepest part of the lake, a small, unnatural hillock, crowned by the ghostly image of a massive, skeletal tree. She hired a team of professional divers. She told them she was looking for a lost piece of Native American history. It was a lie. She was becoming a part of the story's method. The divers went down. The water was dark, murky. They found the island. They found the great oak. They found the hollow at its base. And inside, wrapped in decaying oilcloth, preserved in the cold anaerobic mud, they found the ammunition box. Clara opened it on the shore of the lake. The manuscript was waterlogged, but the doctor's ink had held. The ledger of Jedediah Kane was a pulpy, fragile mess, but the images were still visible. And the photograph was perfectly preserved. Jedediah and Lilith, and the dark, faceless shape in the doorway. Clara read the doctor's manuscript. She looked at the impossible photograph. She felt the world shift under her feet. She was a historian. She dealt in facts. But this was not history. It was a contagion. A story that infected the reader. Some stories end without endings. They fade, like footsteps in ash, or names carved into trees no one passes anymore. If this story followed you into the quiet, leave a like, and subscribe to return to the voices still waiting in the archive.